She was going into criminal justice and ultimately wanted to become a lawyer.
He was an old flame that always got her heart racing.
They're friends with benefits.
Together, they reconnected in a way neither expected.
She was pregnant with this child. It was nothing that was planned.
She was getting together with the father of her child. She was very happy.
But a few short weeks shy of her due date,
Get out of the car!
a shocking abduction sent their fiery romance up in flames.
Get in there!
She feels lighter fluid being doused all over her, and then hears a striking of a match.
Next thing she knew, she was on fire. And she hears 2 gunshots. She feels a pain. She knows she's been shot.
In order to capture the assailant, police must enter a sweltering hothouse of lies, deceit, and unspeakable betrayal.
Ma, I've been kidnapped.
Who would ever contemplate harming a pregnant woman? Why would somebody do this in such cold blood?
May 26, 2012, Detroit, Michigan. In the early morning darkness, a frightened 22-year-old woman is fighting for her life. 9 months pregnant, LaTanya Bowman is engulfed in flames. Her first instinct is to try and extinguish the blaze, but as the fire consumes her, LaTanya remains motionless.
She was abducted, bound with duct tape, set on fire, and she heard 2 gunshots. Knowing that she was injured, possibly shot, she made the decision to play dead in an attempt to save her life and the life of her unborn child.
LaTanya's plan works. Believing she is dead, the monster responsible for this crime flees on foot. When the coast is clear, LaTanya puts out the fire and slowly crawls toward her car.
She's gone into survival mode. This guy leaves the keys in the vehicle. She realizes that and she jumps into the vehicle.
Despite her life-threatening injuries, LaTanya somehow finds her way to the home she shares with her mother.
Oh my God, what happened to you? Let's go to the hospital. Move over.
As LaTanya is rushed into the emergency room, doctors are shocked by the severity of her wounds.
And she's got 2nd and 3rd degree burns. And she's shot. She is very seriously injured.
They weren't sure if she was going to survive, if the child was going to survive.
Hospital personnel contacts police and inform them there's been a crime. One so gruesome it turns the stomachs of even the most calloused investigators.
When it rises to the level where it makes a detective sort of raise his eyebrows, it's unusual. And this one was brutal.
Overnight, LaTanya's harrowing ordeal makes headlines across the country. Local police are feeling the heat. They need to solve this crime and solve it fast. But as investigators race to piece together the puzzle, an unimaginable picture begins to emerge. One of pure evil and a sucker punch expectant mother LaTanya Bowman never saw coming.
We think we've seen it all, but we're always amazed by what humans are capable of doing to another human.
Growing up in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, LaTanya Bowman knew early on what she wanted to do with her life.
She was studying criminal justice in school.
Well, she had that sort of vibrance about her. You know, she was young and hopeful, and, you know, she wasn't somebody out there that was working the streets.
A dedicated and popular student, by the time LaTanya turned 21, she was well on her way to fulfilling her dreams. She was a senior at a local community college and was on track to graduate ahead of schedule.
She had the whole world ahead of her. She was a hardworking college student and very dedicated to excelling.
And among her legion of friends, there was no one LaTanya enjoyed sharing her hopes and ambitions with more than close friend Jamal Rogers. LaTanya and Jamal had been tight since they first met in high school, nearly 6 years earlier.
Not bad, not bad, not bad.
She thinks that this guy is a great guy. And in fact, she told her mother that he's just the nicest guy she's ever met.
Tall, dark, and handsome, LaTanya had long harbored a soft spot in her heart for Jamal. In fact, their connection had never been strictly platonic.
They did pretty much have an on-again, off-again relationship. Both of them described it that way, or more like friends with benefits.
While their physical attraction for one another was undeniable, the two friends felt it best to keep their relationship an open one.
It was really a different kind of relationship. LaTanya had seen other people and has had Jamal, and they were both aware of that, but they would still get together and be intimate and enjoy each other's company.
But in the fall of 2011, LaTanya and Jamal's relationship took an unexpected turn.
Got some good news for you.
Oh, yeah? What's up?
I'm pregnant.
LaTanya wanted him to make the decision to be a part of this child's life, and I really think to be in her life as well. He's a good guy. He's a good friend. And I think she perhaps saw a future with him.
While LaTanya embraced the idea of parenthood, to her surprise, Jamal didn't share her enthusiasm.
Initially, Jamal was very reluctant to have the baby and initially wanted LaTanya to have an abortion.
You plan on keeping it?
Yes, Jamal, I plan on keeping it. Where did that come from?
I think when she got pregnant, Jamal kind of broke off contact for a while.
What? Jamal.
But by the time LaTanya reached her third trimester, Jamal had rekindled their relationship and was as excited about the baby as she was.
So, what about Glendon?
Glendon?
Gillespie.
No.
Come on, that's original. Come on, nobody's got that name.
They were discussing names for the baby. This was, getting very close, and they started to go out and see more of one another.
With their relationship back on track, the couple made plans for a date at a local drive-in theater.
Why don't we go to the movies or something? Let's go hit the drive-in or something.
The drive-in?
Yeah. We're not going to have any time once the baby comes, so we might as well go live a little bit.
You got a point.
Exactly, don't I, baby?
In her eyes, she was getting together with the father of her child to talk through some issues that, of course, two expectant parents are going to have to deal with.
On Friday, May 25th, 2012, LaTanya drove her SUV to the home Jamal shared with his mother. After picking him up, the two headed to the nearby city of Dearborn for a midnight showing at the drive-in. As they watched the film, the two reconnected in ways neither expected.
Baby, look. Now, you know I'm always here for you, right?
Prove it. So I don't believe you. I don't believe
What
it
I got to
right
do
now.
to prove it, huh?
I don't know.
Come
You tell me.
Come here, girl.
They had sex there in the car at the drive-in.
For LaTanya and Jamal, this passionate encounter seemed to cement the rock-solid nature of their relationship. But little did they know that in a few short hours, their lives would take a horrific turn, leaving a young woman fighting for her life and a community desperate for answers.
All of a sudden, she can smell accelerant. And then she kind of hears a click. And the next thing she knows, she can hear crackling. And it's her hair that's on fire.
Let me see what you got.
LaTanya Bowman and Jamal Rogers had been friends since high school, but it didn't take long for the relationship to become more than mere friendship. In September of 2011, LaTanya became pregnant with Jamal's child. And after shaking off a case of cold feet, Jamal seemed ready to be a loving boyfriend and father.
They sort of rekindled their relationship, I guess, or at least were going to try.
The couple's love for each other seemed so intense that just a few weeks before their child was due, Jamal and LaTanya shared a heated tryst at a local drive-in.
They had sex there in the car, in the SUV at the drive-in that they had went to.
But just when it seemed the couple's relationship couldn't get any more perfect, the unthinkable happened. Early on May 26, 2012, just hours after her and Jamal's romantic evening at the drive-in, LaTanya was abducted from Jamal's garage by an unknown assailant. Bound and gagged, she was lit on fire, shot, and left for dead.
The crime that LaTanya Bowman was a victim of has to rank it as one of the most heinous.
I think even for a city like Detroit, the nature of this crime was shocking.
Now, as LaTanya fights for her life and the life of her unborn child in the hospital, police begin to try and piece together what happened. But the key to cracking the case comes down to one important factor.
I needed to talk to the victim. I needed to hear what happened firsthand from her.
Shot in the shoulder and suffering from second and third degree burns, LaTanya has been transferred to the hospital trauma unit. But despite her life-threatening injuries, she's remained conscious throughout her ordeal.
LaTanya,
I'm Detective Barnes. Just wanted to ask you a few questions, if I could. Tanya, I know you're hurting, but I'd like to go through the events of last night. Can you just start from the beginning and tell me what happened?
Visibly shaken, LaTanya lays out the frightening details of her abduction.
Jamal and I went to the drive-in, and I drove back home, and he said that he was gonna open the garage door.
Hey, right here. Let me go open up the garage so you can back in.
Okay.
According to LaTanya, Jamal opened the garage. Just as she parked the car, all hell broke loose.
While inside of the garage, an unknown person came up and grabbed her and held a gun to her head.
Get out of the car! Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
LaTanya tells detectives she did her best to comply with her assailant's demands.
She's in no condition to fight, being 9 months pregnant, so she just complies with what the gunman asked her to do.
The tape didn't cover the bottom of her eyeglasses, so she was able to sort of see just glimpses of the skin on his wrist.
She never sees the person behind her, but her hands are tied up, her feet are bound, her mouth is taped, and she's thrown in the backseat of the vehicle.
Get in the car! I said get in there!
With LaTanya bound and blindfolded, her assailant jumped behind the wheel and took off.
Next thing I know, it felt like we were driving.
Everything happened so quickly, LaTanya isn't sure if Jamal is safe and sound inside the house or had also been attacked.
She's thinking to herself, whatever happened to Jamal, but even more importantly, what's happening to me? How do I protect my baby? How do I get out of this?
LaTanya claims her assailant drove for several minutes before stopping in what seemed to be a remote area. LaTanya hoped her nightmare was nearing an end. Unfortunately, things were about to get much worse.
The gunman had opened the door, and then she remembers feeling a liquid being poured on. She could smell a gassy substance. And she said next thing she knew, she was on fire.
As she feels her hair and her body catching fire, she rolls out of the car and begins rolling around frantically trying to put the fire out.
She described the smell of her burning hair, the crackling of her skin burning. It had to be a horrific set of circumstances for her to live through.
But as LaTanya attempted to extinguish the flames, she suddenly heard a loud pop.
She hears 2 gunshots, one of which strikes her. Believing that she'll be dead soon, she instinctively plays dead.
Miss Bowman performed an amazingly heroic act of having the strength while you're still on fire to be able to play dead. It is just an amazing thing given those horrific circumstances. And the assailant then walked away.
LaTanya tells detectives that once she was sure her abductor had fled the scene, she put out the flames and shook herself free from the duct tape binding her hands and feet.
I heard him run off. When I thought that he was gone, I crawled to the car.
She doesn't have her cell phone at the time. That was taken by the gunman. She sees a gas station that she's familiar with. She goes and uses the phone there.
LaTanya doesn't call 911. She's less concerned with her own safety than she is her mother's.
Ma, I need for you to leave the house. I'm coming to get you.
She thinks her mother is next, and her mother's in grave danger. And somehow, even without her glasses, even in great pain, she manages to get to her mom's house.
Oh my God, what happened to you? Let's go to the hospital. Move over.
Shocked by the sight of her daughter's condition, her mother jumped in the car and rushed LaTanya to the hospital.
It's incredible that she lived. This young woman was her own hero.
Police are astonished by LaTanya's chilling story. But just what could have prompted the attack? And why was LaTanya so gravely concerned about her mother's safety? Apparently, it wasn't the first time a threat had been made against their family.
She's worried about her mother because 2 weeks earlier, there was an incident where a man came to the door very early in the morning. Mom opens the door. Guy sticks a gun in Mom's face. Pulls the trigger, but nothing happens. And he just kind of runs off.
Miss Bowman thought, oh my God, does this have anything to do with that incident? Does this have anything to do with my mother?
Judging by the timing of the two events, LaTanya can't help but fear the worst.
She believes the incident that happened at her house a few weeks earlier is related to what happened to her this evening.
We'll be in touch. Get some rest.
For detectives, LaTanya's statement provides the first break in the case. But before they can follow up on this new lead, they must answer an even more pressing question. Is the father of LaTanya's unborn child, Jamal Rogers, alive and well? Or has he met a fate even worse than hers?
Where was Jamal? We needed to go find him.
In Detroit, a terrifying crime has taken place involving the unlikeliest of victims. 9 months pregnant, LaTanya Bowman was abducted, set on fire, and shot. Amazingly, LaTanya tricked her assailant into believing she was dead.
The whole time she's thinking about her baby. And that's what gave her the courage to play dead. It saves her life.
And after her attacker fled the scene, LaTanya made her way to the hospital, but not before checking on her mother to make sure she hadn't been targeted as well.
Mom, they kidnapped.
In speaking with detectives, LaTanya reveals that the assault might be related to a separate incident that occurred only a couple weeks earlier.
2 weeks prior to the attack, an unknown male showed up at LaTanya's mom's house. When she came to the door, he pointed a gun in her face and pulled the trigger. But the gun did not fire. The male then ran off.
Adding to the mystery is the fact that police aren't sure if LaTanya's attacker also went after Jamal, the father of her unborn child. While one team of officers conducts welfare checks at both LaTanya and Jamal's residences, others fan out across the city in an effort to determine the exact location of the vacant lot where the shooter abandoned LaTanya.
The first thing you think of is this guy shoots somebody and then throws the gun in the street someplace and some 3-year-old finds it. It was a top priority to find that gun. The shell casings, anything we could find in relation to the crime.
But given that LaTanya was blindfolded during the attack, locating the crime scene proves easier said than done.
It was difficult for her to describe a lot of the things around her because it was dark.
So we drove around, hoping to find some evidence of the scene. We were unable to do that.
It's not long before detectives hit another roadblock. Hoping to establish a possible link between LaTanya's abduction and the earlier threat made on her family, detectives reach out to her mother, Angela Beatty.
So I understand from LaTanya that you had some sort of confrontation.
Yeah, it was about 2 weeks ago.
But not only is LaTanya's mother unable to ID the man who allegedly threatened her, she's unsure the two events are even related.
I don't really think it has anything to do with LaTanya at all. I just figured somebody might have just been mad.
LaTanya's mom worked for the city, so sometimes you're dealing with irate citizens, etc. And based on that, she felt it had nothing to do with what happened to LaTanya.
Absolutely not.
Just when it seems like the case has hit a dead end,
Barnes,
detectives receive some promising news from their fellow officers.
you have him there.
Jamal Rogers is alive and well.
Thank you for your time. We need to go.
Officers encountered him during the welfare check of his house, the same house where LaTanya was kidnapped. Detectives are eager to hear his version of the attack.
Jamal Rogers?
Yes?
Need to ask you some questions about LaTanya Bowman.
Surprisingly, Jamal's account of what happened couldn't be more different than LaTanya's.
Jamal said that they left the drive-in theater, came back to his house on Sherman, and parked at the curb.
She dropped you off here?
Yeah, she dropped me off. Yeah, we were out there at the curb, talked for about maybe 10 minutes or so. Then I got out and she drove off.
With Jamal's statement at odds with LaTanya's, detectives wonder if Jamal might be withholding information.
You're sure she dropped you at the curb?
Yeah, positive.
That's when Jamal drops a bombshell.
Is there anybody here that can corroborate that?
Yeah, my mom and my girlfriend and my kids.
You have another girlfriend?
Yeah.
And not one, but two children.
This is a guy who's getting a little bit of action because he's got a girlfriend right here. and a pregnant pal over here.
Given LaTonya's statement and Jamal's startling revelation, detectives can't help but wonder. Could Jamal's girlfriend have orchestrated LaTonya's abduction out of jealousy? And if so, is Jamal now trying to protect her?
We know that Jamal watched this whole incident happen in his garage. He knew more than he was letting on.
Hoping to get to the bottom of this mystery, detectives reach out to a number of Jamal's neighbors. They're hoping to glean additional information about the attack on LaTonya. They catch a break when someone in Jamal's neighborhood tells them they saw Jamal and LaTonya return home from the drive-in the night of the crime.
Apparently there's this character who lives in the neighborhood, and this guy had his eyes open, and he saw them go into that garage, backing into the garage with LaTonya.
With an eyewitness backing LaTonya's story, police decide to bring Jamal in for further questioning. Detectives press Jamal to explain why his version of events is so different than either LaTonya's or his neighbor's.
He instructs LaTonya to pull into this detached garage from his home so they can finish what they supposedly started at the movie theater.
Jamal changes his story and says, yeah, they did pull into the garage.
So you're out of the car? Yes. So you had to close the garage door. She obviously didn't do it, right? Yes.
But before Jamal talks about what happened next, he suddenly has a change of heart.
I think I remember. You want a lawyer? Yeah.
Basically, lawyers up, clams up. That's it. He's done.
Jamal's sudden reluctance to talk raises more than a few red flags with detectives. They decide to hold him in county jail on suspicion of murder. But they're still uncertain whether Jamal's girlfriend could be personally involved. Interviewing her that day, detectives are stunned by what she tells them.
What can you tell me about LaTonya Bowman?
I really don't know that name.
I don't believe that either of the women knew of the other.
Okay, well, were you aware that Jamal was seeing Miss Bowman?
No, I was not.
The fact that Jamal's girlfriend has no idea he's been sleeping with LaTonya seemingly undermines any motive she might have to try and kill her. It also places Jamal alone at the top of the suspect list.
We didn't consider the current girlfriend a suspect, and we believed their relationship at that point didn't come into play.
Desperate for physical evidence, investigators turn their attention to LaTonya's SUV.
Her vehicle was seized, and inside the vehicle, there's some pieces of burned clothing, but there was also a roll of black Gorilla duct tape, which we believe that was the duct tape used by the gunman.
However, DNA tests conducted on both the clothing and duct tape failed to connect Jamal or anyone else to the crime. The case appears to be at a standstill.
The only thing I had going for me at the time was kind of a little bit of hope. I wanted Jamal Rogers to talk to me again.
A few hours later, Detective Barnes' hopes are realized when Jamal Rogers does a surprising about-face.
I almost started to move on to what's the next step going to be. How are we going to identify this other person if Jamal Rogers is not going to give him up? And I walked him all the way back to his cell, and just as I put him in his cell, he said, "Can we talk?"
What does Jamal want to say? He's already lied to investigators once. Would this time be any different? Or is Jamal about to provide detectives with a piece of information that will break the case wide open? On May 26, 2012, expectant mother LaTonya Bowman was kidnapped from inside the garage at the home of her boyfriend, Jamal Rogers. LaTonya was then lit on fire, shot, and left to die in a vacant lot.
So she's been on fire, and then she feels a gunshot. She decides to play dead.
Miraculously, LaTonya survived the terrible ordeal, and the subsequent investigation has led police to the father of her unborn child, Jamal Rogers.
We believe that he was complicit in this abduction and attempt murder.
While initially reluctant to cooperate with police, after being taken into custody, Jamal decides to talk.
He tells cops, "I know who did this."
For detectives, it's a much-needed break in the case.
I just told him that I'm not going to go sit down there and speak to you for 2 hours unless you're going to give me something, so you're going to have to give me a name. And he said, Antonio Valentine Mathis.
Antonio Mathis is no stranger to law enforcement.
He's been in jail, he's done some time, and he's just a really bad guy. And he also happens to be pals with Jamal Rogers. He's his roommate.
Jamal described their relationship, said they were like brothers. He'd allowed Antonio to watch his kids. He just trusted him that much.
According to Jamal, he'd recently confided in Antonio about some problems he was having with LaTanya, and his friend offered to lend a hand.
What'd you say to him?
I said I didn't really want to have another baby.
I don't want to have another baby, man. I can't deal with this, that kind of a thing?
Yes.
So he said,
I could take care of it.
Jamal tells detectives he had no idea what Antonio meant when he said he could take care of it, and he was surprised to find Antonio in his garage when he and LaTanya returned home from the drive-in.
I did say something to him when I seen him show to the car. I was just, what are you doing? What are you doing? What is this about? And he's just like, I got you. Don't worry about it.
Jamal insists Antonio acted on his own.
I didn't ask him to do it. I didn't ask him to do anything.
Jamal's position was that Antonio took this on his own accord and thought to himself, hey, why don't I help Jamal out and somehow help terminate the baby, get her upset or whatever.
Detectives are anxious to speak with Antonio Mathis. They search the neighborhood where he and Jamal live, but can't find him anywhere. At least not until an unexpected tip comes in.
We received a phone call. It was an anonymous phone call. I learned he was going back over the Sherman address. In fact, our officers were sitting on the crime scene. He was arrested.
Even with Antonio in custody, detectives' hopes of getting a confession are soon dashed.
when they got back at 1:30, you're in the garage. I never came back to the house that night. I came back to the house the next morning. He was lying about everything. I don't know.
Antonio denies any knowledge of this whole event. He says he just got pointed out as a guy that, because he had a record, he would be a good fall guy.
Antonio also claims he has an airtight alibi. He was with his girlfriend the night of the crime.
She's going to be your alibi for the whole night. That's what's her name?
The assailant's alibi was a friend of his, Tanisha McCaddy. She picked him up at midnight and drove him to another girl's house. That girl, Crystal King, was with him at the time of the assault.
Investigators suspect Antonio's alibi is bogus. And after speaking with Crystal King and Tanisha McCaddy, that suspicion is justified.
The timeline that he gave us was totally inconsistent with what had actually happened, according to Tanisha McCaddy and his girlfriend.
Tanisha and Crystal both state that Antonio didn't hook up with them until the morning after the crime, which supports the theory that Antonio was the gunman who attacked LaTanya Bowman. But did Antonio act alone? Or did he and Jamal conspire to murder Jamal's pregnant girlfriend? In order to elicit more information from their two prime suspects, detectives make a bold play.
Cops are pretty clever. You know, they're going to start playing these two guys against each other.
I thought we maybe would talk to Jamal again and see if he give us a little bit more.
He claims he's innocent. Wasn't anywhere near you and LaTanya. And he's got an alibi and witnesses.
Man, he lying.
Jamal, you're gonna have to give me something concrete, or I'm gonna have to let him go, and you're gonna go down for the whole thing.
I was kind of acting a little mad at him. I told him, this is your last chance. You're gonna give me some evidence that I can corroborate, or that's it. We're done talking.
The two words Jamal utters next will lead detectives to the unlikeliest of locations. A location that will bring them one step closer to putting LaTanya's true attacker behind bars. Police now believe Jamal Rogers is responsible for the attempted murder of LaTanya Bowman, the mother of his unborn child. But Jamal insists he's innocent and pins the crime on his best friend and roommate.
Man, he lying.
He's going to roll over on his buddy, this guy named Antonio Mathis.
Jamal claims that shortly before the attack on LaTanya, he made an offhand comment about not wanting another child. Unbeknownst to Jamal, Antonio took his comment seriously and without his knowledge, orchestrated the hit on Jamal's pregnant girlfriend. However, when Antonio was arrested, He claims no knowledge of the attack on LaTanya.
Antonio said he didn't do anything. It's all Jamal.
According to Antonio, he was with his girlfriend Crystal King and pal Tanisa McCaddy the night of the crime. But Crystal and Tanisa tell detectives that's simply not the case.
We knew we had the right guy. The question is, do we have enough to make it stick?
The other question is whether Antonio acted alone, as Jamal Rogers claims, or whether the two men conspired to attack LaTanya.
He's thrown you under the bus. He's going to do whatever he can to save his own ass right now. He already did. He already did. He told us he told you not to do anything to her. You know what that looks like? You went out and did this on your own.
In an effort to uncover the truth, detectives then decide to play Jamal and Antonio against each other.
Jamal, you're going to have to give me something concrete, or I'm going to have to let him go, and you're going to go down for the whole thing.
Fearful of taking the fall for the crime all by himself, Jamal offers 2 words.
Jamal says,
Home Depot.
I drove him to Home Depot right before I went to go to the movies with LaTanya.
Operating off this information, detectives reach out to a nearby Home Depot. They are able to confirm that the gloves and duct tape found in LaTanya's car were indeed purchased there.
Home Depot was nice enough to provide us with the exact items that he purchased from their shelves. So we had a SKU number for the duct tape. We had the exact type of Gorilla duct tape, the exact gloves he bought.
Detectives confront Antonio Mathis with this evidence, but Antonio remains adamant he had nothing to do with the crime.
But I guess he forgot. Home Depot has security cameras.
Police are confident that if the surveillance footage places Antonio at the store, they'll have enough probable cause to charge him with attempted murder. Detective John Barnes screens the security footage, but after 90 minutes, there's still no sign of their prime suspect.
You know, and Antonio hasn't come into the store, and I almost started thinking, what do we do now that we don't have this piece of evidence?
But just as he's about to give up, Detective Barnes finally hits pay dirt.
Right there, look.
I think it was around 9:55 p.m., 5 minutes before the store closed. In walks Antonio Mathis. I knew right then that we'd locked Antonio Mathis into this.
There he goes. He's got the gloves and he's got the duct tape. Yep. That's what we've been looking for.
Even with this video evidence, detectives are still fairly confident that Antonio didn't act alone. They believe Jamal Rogers, already saddled with 2 young children, couldn't bear the thought of having to support another child with LaTanya. And when Antonio told Jamal he could make his problem go away, Jamal jumped at the offer.
I think that Antonio told Jamal, I can take care of this for you. And by take care, we know that means kill her and the baby, and the problem goes away.
On May 29, 2012, police officially charged Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis with unlawful imprisonment, assault with intent to commit murder, and conspiracy. News of Jamal's arrest adds insult to LaTanya's already devastating injuries.
I think she loved him, and she didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to believe that he was capable of something like this. And I could understand.
Ironically, the same day charges are filed against the 2 men, LaTanya gives birth to a healthy baby boy.
The baby is fine. Mom, LaTanya, is apparently recovering physically. This is an incredible story of courage and survival.
Over the next year, LaTanya also begins to heal emotionally as she waits for justice to be served.
She went through some tough times, and we weren't going to rest. Not from day one, not until this is over with. And we get the results that she deserves.
On May 22, 2013, the trial of Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis begins in a Macomb County courtroom. In their opening statement, prosecutors assert Jamal Rogers, not wanting to be a father again, asked his friend Antonio Mathis to kill his pregnant girlfriend, LaTanya Bowman.
Obviously, Mr. Mathis was supposed to kill Miss Bowman. She was totally blindsided by the violence that she was subjected to at both of their hands.
Prosecutors then lay out the evidence tying Antonio to the crime: the duct tape and the gloves found in LaTanya's SUV. as well as the security footage that shows Antonio Mathis purchasing them the night of the attack.
Having the Gorilla duct tape in that courtroom and being able to show them, this is what was bought and this is what we found in the car. And them actually seeing that purchase made, that was huge.
After presenting the physical evidence, prosecutors turn to their star witness, LaTanya Bowman. Everyone in the courtroom is mesmerized as she gives a blow-by-blow account of her nightmarish abduction.
She was very calm in her testimony, which is kind of typical of her actions throughout this ordeal. I think the jury was absolutely listening to every word that she said and were undoubtedly impacted.
On the stand, LaTanya admits she had a hard time believing that Jamal was involved in the crime. But she also refutes Jamal's claim that they had sex the night of the abduction.
She denied the sex at the drive-in theater. Jamal seemed to be totally baffled by that, why she's saying that. And, that was a big part of his case.
But not everything LaTanya testifies to bolsters the prosecution's case. Her inability to concretely identify her assailant is a boon for the defense.
She readily admitted that the defendant was shorter than the man that she felt had abducted her. She really didn't pinpoint my client as being the person that abducted her.
Beyond LaTanya's testimony, the defense also argues that Jamal and Antonio's DNA was never found on the gloves and duct tape, nor was there the usual paper trail left behind when one person solicits another to commit murder on their behalf.
We had shown that there was absolutely no financial things happening between Mr. Rogers and Mr. Mathis. There was no withdrawals or anything like that on Mr. Rogers' part. There was no deposits on top of Mr. Mathis like there normally might be if somebody's asking somebody to commit a crime.
Despite LaTanya's heroic turn on the stand, there seems to be nothing but some security footage linking Antonio to the crime and zero physical evidence implicating Jamal. A guilty verdict seems unlikely. But before the jury weighs in, the prosecution will unveil a surprise witness, one whose shocking testimony will be the deciding factor between two men walking free or being locked up for life. After an intense few days in the courtroom, the trial of Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis for the attempted murder of LaTanya Bowman is wrapping up. Armed with a security tape of Antonio purchasing items that were used in the crime, along with LaTanya's gripping testimony, the prosecution is feeling confident.
We were all of the mind that we presented the best case we could possibly present.
But defense attorneys argue there's simply no proof that their clients plotted any murder.
There's no actual concrete evidence of any sort that there was any kind of conspiracy between the people.
However, prosecutors still have one last witness on the docket, Antonio's friend, Tanisa McCaddy. On the stand, Tanisa reveals a detailed conversation she had with Antonio shortly after the attack on LaTanya.
McCaddy, she said he was unusually quiet. And she asked him what was wrong, and he didn't want to tell her. And he just said, nothing, but I need you to stay away from me for a while.
If I remember, the exact words may have been, we did some awful to a pregnant woman. So she did testify to that in court, and that certainly didn't sound good at all.
Well, this guy, Antonio Mathis, is a real brain surgeon. I mean, who actually does something like this? And then they talk about it and even brag about it. But that's what Antonio did, and that's what also helped police nail him to the wall.
But is it enough to convince the jury that both Antonio and Jamal were involved in the crime? After 3 hours of deliberations, the jury returns with their verdict. They find Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis guilty on all charges.
The first thing we all did is, after hearing guilty of all charges, is we all looked at Miss Bowman, and we all went and hugged her.
2 months later, the two defendants are sentenced to life in prison. The judge has some particularly harsh words for Jamal.
Even though you did not light the match or pull the trigger, you orchestrated perhaps one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. You diabolically and in cold blood plotted, schemed, and arranged the murder of your unborn child.
Jamal, once he's sentenced, basically blows a kiss to the audience. It's incredible arrogance.
For LaTanya Bowman, the sentencing serves as a bittersweet end to her tragic relationship with Jamal. And while the physical and emotional scars wrought by his betrayal still linger, LaTanya refuses to be defined by what happened that fateful night in 2012.
You'd think it just ruined you, and it didn't ruin her. Even though you have these kind of people out there, and this kind of evil out there, that good comes through.
I hope she one day uses this courageous experience of how she was able to save herself and her unborn child, and she can give some counsel to other women. She'll probably save some lives.
The video does not begin with chaos. It begins with stillness. A room that looks almost ordinary at first glance, lit in a way that feels deliberate rather than accidental. The camera does not shake. It does not rush. It observes. There is a sense of control in every frame, as if nothing inside that space is left to chance. And somewhere within that stillness, something feels wrong, not immediately visible, not yet defined, but present in the way the silence stretches just a little too long. Then movement. Not sudden, not frantic. Measured. The kind of movement that suggests intention rather than impulse. The person behind it does not hesitate, does not second-guess. There is no visible rush of emotion, no sign of panic. Just a steady progression, as if each action has already been rehearsed somewhere else, long before the camera was ever turned on. For those who would later encounter this footage, the experience would not be defined by what they expected to see, but by how it unfolded. It was not simply the content, but the pacing, the absence of urgency. The way time seemed to stretch and compress at the same time, forcing the viewer to remain present, unable to look away even when instinct demanded it. And yet, before the video ever surfaced, before it became a shockwave that moved across the internet, there were already signs, small, fragmented, scattered across digital spaces where most people never look closely enough to notice patterns forming. Accounts that appeared and disappeared. Comments that echoed each other in tone, in structure, in timing. Images that seemed too polished, too carefully constructed to be entirely real. A persona built piece by piece, not just to exist, but to be seen, to be noticed, to be talked about. He did not wait for attention. He manufactured it. In online forums, in comment sections, in places where identities blur and shift, there were traces of someone who understood how visibility worked. Not in the traditional sense of fame, but in something more controlled, more curated. He did not just present himself. He shaped the narrative around himself, creating the illusion of interest, of intrigue, of significance. People noticed, but not in the way he wanted. At first, it was confusion, then curiosity, then something closer to unease. There was a disconnect between the image and the behavior, between the polished exterior and the patterns that began to emerge underneath. It was subtle, easy to dismiss if taken in isolation. But when viewed together, those fragments began to suggest something else, something that did not fit comfortably within the boundaries of ordinary online behavior. Still, nothing prepared anyone for what would come next. When the video finally appeared, it did not arrive quietly. It spread rapidly, crossing platforms, borders, languages. It did not need promotion. It carried its own momentum, driven by shock, by disbelief, by the need to understand whether what was being seen was real. For many, the first reaction was denial. This has to be staged. It has to be fake. It has to be something constructed for attention, exaggerated beyond reality. That assumption held for only a moment, just long enough for the details to settle in, for the realization to take hold that this was not fiction, not performance in the way people understood it. This was something else entirely. As the video circulated, so did the questions. Who made this? Where did it come from? And, perhaps most urgently, was it over, or was it still happening somewhere beyond the frame? Law enforcement agencies were pulled into the situation almost immediately, but the speed of the internet outpaced the speed of any official response. By the time investigators began tracing the origins, the footage had already reached thousands, then hundreds of thousands, embedding itself into the collective awareness in a way that could not be reversed. What made it even more unsettling was not just the act itself, but the way it had been presented. This was not a moment captured in panic or desperation. It was arranged, composed. The angles, the timing, the sequence. Everything pointed to preparation, to a mindset that extended beyond the immediate act into something more deliberate, more calculated. It was not just violence. It was performance. And somewhere behind that performance was a person who had anticipated this reaction, who had understood how it would spread, how it would be received, how it would place him at the center of a conversation that could not ignore him. By the time his name began to surface, it did not emerge from nowhere. It connected back to those earlier traces, the scattered digital footprints that now took on a different meaning. What once seemed like fragmented, isolated behavior now formed a pattern, a progression that led directly to this moment. The online persona was no longer just a curiosity. It was part of something much larger, something that had been building over time. And as investigators began to piece together that progression, another realization began to take shape. This was not the beginning. It only felt like it. Because what had surfaced in that video was not a sudden transformation, not a break from an otherwise ordinary path. It was an escalation, a crossing of a line that had been approached gradually, step by step, in ways that had not been fully understood until it was too late. Somewhere along that path, the boundary between seeking attention and demanding it had disappeared. And in its place, something far more dangerous had taken hold. The kind of danger that does not rely on secrecy, that does not hide in the shadows, but instead moves toward visibility, toward exposure, toward an audience. A danger that grows stronger not in isolation, but in being seen, in being discussed, in being remembered. As the investigation began to unfold, as names were confirmed and timelines established, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not just a case about what had been done. It was about why it had been shown. Why someone would not only commit such an act, but ensure that it would be witnessed, shared, and embedded into the consciousness of anyone who came across it. Why the act itself was not enough. Why it had to be transformed into something that extended beyond the moment, beyond the physical space in which it occurred. Those questions did not have immediate answers, but they set the stage for everything that followed. Because understanding this case would not be as simple as identifying a suspect or reconstructing a timeline. It would require something deeper, something more complex, a willingness to look not just at the act, but at the layers surrounding it, the patterns leading up to it, the environment that allowed it to take shape. And in that complexity, the story began. Not with the crime itself, but with the quiet, calculated steps that made it inevitable. Montreal does not announce its dangers. It rarely needs to. The city moves with a rhythm that feels layered rather than rushed, a place where old stone buildings stand beside modern glass, where narrow streets open into wider avenues filled with cafes, late-night conversations, and the low hum of traffic that never quite disappears. In late spring, the air softens just enough to invite people back outside after the long Canadian winter, and life spills out onto sidewalks in a way that feels almost effortless. It is the kind of place where anonymity is easy, where a person can exist among thousands without ever truly being noticed. That anonymity, for most, is comfort. For someone else, it can be something entirely different. The apartment buildings scattered across neighborhoods like Côte-de-Neige or the Plateau are not remarkable from the outside. Rows of windows, balconies with metal railings, the occasional flicker of a television screen behind thin curtains. Inside, lives unfold quietly, each one contained within its own walls. People come and go, carrying groceries, speaking in different languages, passing each other in hallways with polite nods or no acknowledgement at all. It is a city that allows distance, that does not demand familiarity. In one of those buildings, behind a door that looked no different from any other, a life was being constructed with a precision that did not match the ordinary surroundings. He had learned early how to present himself. Not in the way most people do, through gradual interaction or shared experience, but through careful curation. Images selected, edited, adjusted until they conveyed exactly what he wanted them to convey. Online profiles built not as reflections of reality, but as versions of it, refined, exaggerated, controlled. Each post, each photograph, each comment placed with intention, designed to create an impression that extended beyond the person behind it. There was no single identity. There were many. Different names, different accounts, different fragments of a persona that could shift depending on the audience. In one space, he was confident, almost glamorous. In another, elusive, mysterious. And behind those variations, something consistent, a need not just to be seen, but to shape how that visibility was experienced by others. It was not enough for people to notice him. They had to notice him in the right way. This need did not develop suddenly. It grew, gradually, reinforced by small moments, an increase in attention, a comment that lingered longer than the others, a brief sense of recognition that faded too quickly. Each of these moments left behind something unfinished, something that pushed him to seek more, to refine his approach, to adjust the presentation until it produced the reaction he wanted. But attention is unpredictable. What draws it once does not always draw it again. What works in one moment can disappear in the next, leaving behind a gap that feels larger than it actually is. For someone who relies on that attention, who builds their sense of presence around it, that gap does not feel like absence, it feels like failure. And failure, in this context, does not lead to withdrawal. It leads to escalation. Long before the events that would later define the case, there were indications of this shift. Not in obvious, immediate ways, but in patterns that became clearer only when viewed over time. The content he shared began to change. The tone shifted, subtly at first, then more noticeably. What had once been focused on appearance and image started to incorporate elements that were more provocative, more unsettling. It was not a complete break from the previous persona. It was an extension of it, a testing of boundaries. Online, where distance creates a sense of separation from consequence, those boundaries can be pushed further than they might be elsewhere. Reactions become data points. Responses become indicators of what works and what is not. And for someone who is paying close attention, who is actively shaping their behavior based on those responses, the process becomes iterative.
Try something.
Observe the reaction.
Adjust. Repeat.
In this cycle, the line between performance and reality begins to blur. Actions are no longer just expressions of self. They become tools, methods of generating response, ways of maintaining visibility in a space where attention is constantly shifting. At the same time, beyond the digital layer, the physical environment remains unchanged. The same streets, the same buildings, the same routines. People passing each other without knowing the roles they play in each other's lives, if any at all. A city that continues to function, unaware of the specific trajectory unfolding within it. This contrast between the controlled, constructed online presence and the ordinary, unremarkable physical surroundings creates a kind of separation. Two worlds existing in parallel, intersecting only at certain points, each influencing the other in ways that are not always immediately visible. It is within that intersection that the story begins to take shape. Because what happens online does not remain there indefinitely. It informs behavior, influences decisions, creates patterns that eventually extend beyond the screen. The distance between action and consequence, which once felt wide, begins to narrow. And when that happens, the shift is not always obvious from the outside. There are no sudden alarms, no clear signals that something has crossed from one realm into another. The transition is gradual, built on a series of small steps that, taken individually, might not seem significant. But together, they form a path that leads somewhere specific. In the weeks leading up to the crime, that path had already been laid. The pieces were in place, the patterns established. The environment, both digital and physical, had been shaped in ways that allowed for what would come next. And still, to anyone looking from the outside, everything appeared normal. The city moved as it always had. People went about their days, unaware of the convergence that was approaching. The apartment buildings remained quiet, their walls holding stories that no one else could see. The online spaces continued to shift and evolve, filled with countless voices, countless identities, most of them passing through without leaving a lasting mark. But among them, there was one that did not intend to pass quietly. One that had been building, adjusting, refining itself over time, moving steadily towards something that would break through the noise in a way that could not be ignored. The setting, in that sense, was not just a place. It was a convergence of conditions. A city that allowed anonymity. A digital world that rewarded visibility. A person who understood both, and who had begun to move between them with increasing purpose. And somewhere within that convergence, the line between performance and reality was about to disappear completely. Before his name became something spoken in past tense, before it was attached to headlines and courtrooms and a story that would travel far beyond the city where it began, there was a life that moved quietly through ordinary spaces, marked not by spectacle, but by routine. Jun Lin did not stand out in the way some people do. He did not demand attention when he entered a room, did not shape the atmosphere around him. Instead, he blended into it, becoming part of the rhythm of the places he occupied. He arrived in Montreal carrying something that many international students carry, a mixture of expectation and uncertainty, a sense of possibility balanced by the weight of distance. The city was not home, not in the way that feels immediate and unquestioned. It was something to be learned, navigated, slowly understood through experience. The streets, the language, the patterns of daily life, everything required adjustment, small acts of adaptation that accumulated over time.
He studied.
He worked. He built a routine that made sense within the structure of his new environment. There is a particular kind of resilience in that process, though it often goes unnoticed. It is not dramatic, not visible in a single moment, but it exists in the consistency of effort, in the willingness to move forward even when familiarity is not yet established. It shows in the way someone learns the layout of a city by walking it, in the way they begin to recognize faces, to understand unspoken norms, to find their place within a system that once felt entirely foreign. For Jun Lin, that process unfolded gradually. He attended classes, spent time with friends, balanced the demands of study with the need to support himself. There were long days, like there are for many students, where time seemed to compress under the weight of responsibilities. And there were quieter moments, brief spaces where the pressure eased, where conversation and laughter created a sense of belonging that did not need to be explained. Those who knew him described something consistent, not in grand terms, not in exaggerated praise, but in simple observations. He was kind. He was approachable. He listened more than he spoke. These are not qualities that draw attention from a distance, but they shape the way a person is experienced up close, in the everyday interactions that define relationships. He did not build his life around visibility. He built it around connection. There is a difference between those two things, though it is not always immediately obvious. Visibility seeks recognition, often from as many sources as possible. Connection is more focused, more personal. It exists in specific interactions, in the shared understanding between individuals who occupy the same space, even if only briefly. For someone living far from home, those connections carry additional weight. They become points of stability, ways of anchoring oneself in an environment that is still being understood. They provide continuity, a sense that even in a place that is new, there are elements that feel consistent, reliable. Outside of those connections, there was also distance. The physical distance from family, from the places that had shaped him before he ever arrived in Canada. That distance is not always felt in immediate ways. It does not define every moment, but it exists quietly, in the background, surfacing in certain situations, holidays, significant events, moments where the absence of familiarity becomes more noticeable. Communication bridges some of that distance, but not all of it. Messages, calls, shared updates, they maintain a link, but they do not replace presence. There is always a gap, small but persistent, between where someone is and where they came from. And within that gap, life continues. Days pass in a pattern that becomes increasingly familiar. The city begins to feel less foreign, more navigable. The initial uncertainty softens, replaced by a growing sense of understanding. The routines that once required effort become automatic, part of a daily structure that no longer needs to be consciously maintained. From the outside, it might appear simple. A student living his life, moving through the expected stages of study, work, social interaction. There is nothing in that image that suggests disruption, nothing that indicates the direction in which the story will eventually move. But stories do not always signal their turning points in advance. They do not announce the moments where paths intersect in ways that will change everything that follows. Those moments often appear ordinary at the time, indistinguishable from the countless other interactions that make up daily life. A meeting, a conversation, a decision that does not feel significant when it is made. And yet, those are the moments where trajectories shift. For Junlin, the path he was on did not contain visible warning signs. It was not marked by risk in any obvious way, not shaped by choices that would raise concern from those around him. It followed the structure that many lives follow, steady, gradual, oriented toward goals that are both immediate and long-term. That is part of what makes what follows so difficult to reconcile. Because there is no clear line connecting the life he was living to the events that would later define how he is remembered. No direct cause that can be pointed to, no decision that can be isolated as the moment everything changed. Instead, there is a contrast, a stark difference between the quiet consistency of his daily life and the disruption that would come from outside it. In that contrast, the human dimension of the story becomes clearer, not as a set of facts or details, but as a recognition of what was present before anything was taken away. A life that existed in its own right, with its own rhythm, its own connections, its own direction. A life that was not defined by the event that ended it, even though that event would later shape how it was understood by others. And it is within that understanding that the importance of remembering the victim as more than a name becomes clear. Because before the headlines, before the investigation, before the questions that would follow, there was a person moving through a city, building something step by step, in ways that were quiet but meaningful. A person whose story did not begin with what happened to him, and should not be reduced to it. The night did not arrive with any sense of warning. It settled over the city the same way it always did, gradually dimming the outlines of buildings, softening the edges of streets, drawing curtains over windows where light still lingered behind glass. Montreal continued to move, quieter than during the day, but far from asleep. Cars passed in steady intervals. Footsteps echoed briefly in narrow corridors between buildings, and somewhere in the distance, voices rose and fell before fading into the background. Inside one apartment, the air felt different. Not colder, not heavier in any obvious way, but arranged. That is the closest word for it. Objects placed where they were meant to be, the space not chaotic but deliberate, as if it had been prepared with a purpose that extended beyond ordinary use. The lighting was controlled, neither too bright nor too dim, casting shadows that did not obscure but also did not fully reveal. There is a particular kind of tension that exists in spaces like this, though it is not immediately visible. It is not something that can be pointed to directly, but it can be felt in the stillness, in the way the room seems to be waiting for something to happen. When Junlin entered that space, there was nothing to suggest that it would become anything other than another moment in a series of ordinary interactions. A meeting, perhaps brief, perhaps unremarkable. The kind of moment that does not stand out, that does not signal its own significance. And yet, from the very beginning, the balance of that space did not belong equally to both people inside it. One of them moved with familiarity, with the quiet confidence of someone who understood every detail of the environment. The other was entering it for the first time, navigating it without the same level of awareness, relying on what could be seen, what could be assumed, what felt normal enough not to question. That difference, subtle, almost invisible, was already shaping what would follow. There are moments when intention exists before action, when something has already been decided long before it begins to unfold. Those moments are difficult to detect from the outside because they do not announce themselves. They exist in preparation, in planning, in the quiet accumulation of decisions that lead to a single point. Inside that apartment, that point had already been reached. What followed did not happen in a rush. It did not explode into motion without warning. It unfolded in a way that felt controlled, measured, as if each step had been anticipated. There was no hesitation, no visible struggle to decide what to do next. The sequence of actions moved forward with a kind of steady progression that made it clear this was not spontaneous. For the victim, the realization did not come all at once. It rarely does. It arrives in fragments, in small shifts of perception that do not immediately form a complete picture. A detail that feels slightly off. A pause that lasts just a moment too long. A movement that does not align with expectation. These fragments begin to accumulate slowly, quietly, until they reach a point where they can no longer be ignored. By then, the situation has already changed. The room, which once felt neutral, begins to take on a different quality. The space between objects seems narrower, the distance to the door longer. Familiar assumptions about safety, about control, begin to unravel, replaced by something less certain, more urgent. And within that shift, the reality of the situation begins to emerge. The person who had controlled the environment from the beginning does not lose that control. If anything, it becomes more pronounced. Movements remain deliberate, precise. There is no visible escalation in emotion, no outward sign of panic or instability. The calmness persists, but it is no longer neutral. It is defining. It creates an imbalance that is difficult to counter. Because in situations where one person is reacting and the other is executing, the dynamic is already set. One is trying to understand what is happening, to find a way to respond. The other has already moved beyond that stage, operating within a framework that was established long before the moment began. Time behaves differently in these moments. It does not pass in a steady, predictable flow. It stretches, compresses, fragments. Seconds feel longer, then suddenly disappear. The sequence of events becomes difficult to track, not because it is chaotic, but because it is too focused, too concentrated within a confined space. And throughout it, the environment remains the same. The same walls, the same furniture, the same light casting the same shadows. Nothing external changes, and yet everything within that space has shifted completely. What was once an ordinary setting has become something else entirely, something that exists outside the normal expectations of daily life. There are no clear boundaries marking that transition. No point where the room itself signals what it has become. It simply holds what is happening within it. And when it is over, when the movement stops, when the sequence reaches its end, the stillness returns. But it is not the same stillness that existed before. It carries something different now, something that cannot be undone, cannot be reversed. The space remains, but it has been altered. Not physically, not in ways that are immediately visible to someone who has not been there, but in the way it contains what has occurred. In the way it holds the absence that follows, the silence that settles in after everything else has stopped. Outside, the city continues. Cars pass. Lights remain on in other windows. People move through their own routines, unaware of what has just taken place behind one closed door among thousands. There is no interruption, no visible sign that anything has changed. But inside that apartment, something has ended. And something else, something far more complex, has just begun. The first signs did not come from the apartment itself. They arrived in fragments, disconnected pieces that, on their own, did not immediately form a coherent picture. A package here, another there. Labels, addresses, the ordinary markers of something sent from one place to another. But what was inside those packages disrupted that sense of normalcy so completely that the routine process of handling them became something else entirely. At first, there was confusion. The people who encountered them were not prepared for what they were seeing. Their expectations had been shaped by repetition, by the assumption that most things follow predictable patterns. When something falls outside those patterns, the mind resists it, searching for an alternative explanation, something that fits more comfortably within what is known. But there are moments when no such explanation is available, when the only possibility is the one that does not belong. As the reality of those packages began to settle in, the response shifted quickly from uncertainty to urgency. Authorities were contacted, procedures initiated, spaces secured. What had started as isolated incidents began to connect, not through clear lines, but through the growing realization that they were not random. They were part of something larger. At the same time, The video continued to circulate, its presence expanding across digital platforms, reaching people who had no connection to the physical locations where the investigation was beginning to take shape. The online and offline worlds, which had been operating separately, were now intersecting in a way that made the situation more complex, more difficult to contain. Investigators were no longer dealing with a single scene. They were dealing with multiple points of entry into the same event, each one offering a different perspective, a different set of clues. The packages, the video, the absence of the victim. Each of these elements carried information, but none of them, on their own, provided a complete understanding. That understanding would have to be built, carefully, methodically. The apartment, when it was finally entered, did not reveal everything at once. Scenes like this rarely do. They present themselves in layers, each detail becoming visible only after the initial shock has passed, after the mind has adjusted enough to begin processing what is in front of it. The door opened into a space that, at first glance, still resembled an ordinary living environment. Furniture in place. Objects arranged in ways that suggested routine use. But that impression did not hold for long. It began to break apart as attention moved from the general to the specific, from the overall layout to the individual details that did not belong. There are certain indicators that investigators are trained to recognize, patterns that suggest disruption, that signal the presence of something beyond the ordinary. In this case, those indicators were not subtle. They were present in the way objects had been disturbed, in the traces left behind that could not be explained by normal activity. Marks that indicated force, residue that suggested movement, contact, the sequence of actions that had taken place within those walls. But even as those details were documented, there was something else that stood out. A sense that the scene had not been abandoned in haste. There was no clear sign of panic, no evidence of a rushed exit. Instead, there were indications that time had been spent there after the event itself had concluded, that the person responsible had remained, had moved through the space with intention, interacting with it in ways that extended beyond the immediate act. This introduced a different dimension to the investigation. It was no longer just about what had happened in a moment of violence, but about what had followed, about the decisions made after, the actions taken not under pressure, but with time to consider, to choose, to proceed without interruption. That distinction matters, because it speaks to state of mind, to the level of control involved, to the absence of urgency that might otherwise explain certain behaviors. It suggests that what occurred was not confined to a single point in time, but was part of a broader sequence, one that included preparation, execution, and aftermath. Each of these phases leaves its own traces. And those traces, when examined together, begin to form a narrative. Not a complete one, not yet, but a structure that can be built upon. Evidence was collected systematically. Samples taken. Photographs documented. Every detail preserved in a way that would allow for later analysis, for the reconstruction of events that could no longer be observed directly. This process is meticulous, often slow, but it is essential. It transforms a space from a site of confusion into a source of information. At the same time, outside the apartment, the investigation was expanding. The packages had to be traced, their origins identified, their paths reconstructed. Each one represented a point of contact between the suspect and the outside world, a moment where something had been moved from one place to another, leaving behind a record that could potentially be followed. The video, too, became a source of evidence. Not just in its content, but in its technical details. The way it was recorded, the elements visible within it, the metadata embedded in the file, all of these offered potential leads. Digital forensics teams began working to extract whatever information they could, looking for connections, for indicators that could link the online material to a physical location, to a person. As these efforts progressed, the separate strands of the case began to converge. The physical evidence from the apartment, the distribution of the packages, the presence of the video online. Each of these elements pointed in the same direction, reinforcing each other, reducing the range of possibilities, narrowing the focus of the investigation. But even as that focus sharpened, there remained a sense of scale that made the situation difficult to contain. because this was not a case that existed solely within the boundaries of a single location. It had already extended beyond that, reaching into digital spaces, crossing geographical lines, creating a network of information that was both expansive and fragmented. Managing that complexity required coordination, communication, the ability to move between different types of evidence and understand how they related to each other. And through it all, one question remained at the center. Who had done this? Not just in the sense of identifying a name, but in understanding the person behind the actions, the pattern that connected the preparation to the execution to the aftermath. The evidence was beginning to provide answers, but those answers were not yet complete. They were forming. Piece by piece, detail by detail, the picture was becoming clearer. The scene, once a place of uncertainty, was turning into a map, one that, if followed carefully enough, would lead to the person responsible. And as that map took shape, the investigation moved from discovery into pursuit. By the time the investigation moved into its next phase, the case had already begun to stretch beyond the boundaries of a single crime scene. It was no longer contained within the walls of the apartment or the locations where the packages had surfaced. It had entered a different space, one defined by movement, by shifting identities, by the absence of a fixed point where everything could be anchored. Investigators now faced a different kind of challenge. Not simply identifying what had happened, but determining who was responsible in a landscape where information could be altered, hidden, or deliberately manipulated. The digital traces left behind were not straightforward. They did not form a clean, linear path from action to identity. Instead, they branched, overlapped, and in some cases contradicted each other, creating a web that required careful navigation. The name began to appear more frequently. At first, it was just one of several possibilities, a reference that surfaced in connection with the video, with certain online accounts, with fragments of information that seemed to point in a similar direction. But as those fragments were examined more closely, as patterns were compared and timelines aligned, that name started to carry more weight. Luca Magnotta. It was not unfamiliar to some. There were already traces of his presence online, records of past behavior that, when viewed in isolation, might have seemed strange, but not necessarily alarming. But within the context of the current investigation, those same traces took on a different significance. They were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern, one that suggested continuity rather than coincidence. Still, identifying a name was only the beginning. It did not immediately provide location, did not guarantee that the person in question could be found, questioned, or stopped. If anything, it introduced a new complication, the realization that the suspect was aware of the attention, aware of the investigation, and potentially prepared to respond to it. There were indications of movement, records of travel, fragments of data that suggested departure, transitions from one place to another. Not a clear itinerary, not a documented route, but enough to indicate that the person being sought was no longer stationary, that he had anticipated the need to leave, to create distance between himself and the place where the events had occurred. This shifted the investigation into a broader scope. Local authorities were no longer working alone. The case began to involve international coordination, the sharing of information across jurisdictions, the need to track movement that extended beyond national borders. Each new piece of data had to be verified, cross-referenced, placed within a timeline that was still being constructed. And within that process, there were moments where the trail seemed to fade. Not disappear entirely, but become less clear, less direct. A lead that did not fully resolve. A location that could not be confirmed. A piece of information that suggested one direction, only to be followed by another that contradicted it. These are the points where investigations can stall, where uncertainty begins to slow progress. But in this case, something else was happening alongside the official effort. Outside the formal structures of law enforcement, there were individuals, groups of people connected not by profession, but by shared interest who had already been following a different trail. Long before the crime had occurred, they had been tracking the online activity associated with the same name, analyzing patterns, comparing details, attempting to identify a person who had, until then, existed primarily in digital form. Now their focus aligned with the investigation. They were not working within the same framework, not bound by the same procedures, but they were observing the same subject, looking at the same body of information from a different angle. In some cases, their insights overlapped with those of investigators. In others, they diverged, introducing theories that required careful evaluation. This convergence created both opportunity and risk. On one hand, it expanded the pool of information, introduced perspectives that might not have been considered otherwise. On the other, it introduced noise, unverified claims, assumptions, interpretations that could not always be substantiated. Sorting through this required discernment, the ability to separate what was useful from what was misleading. Meanwhile, the suspect remained out of reach. Each confirmed movement suggested another step taken ahead of the investigation, another moment where he had anticipated the need to stay ahead, to maintain distance. This was not a random flight. It followed a pattern, one that suggested awareness, planning, and understanding of how pursuit would unfold. And within that pattern, there was something else. A continued presence online. Even after the crime, even as the investigation intensified, there were signs that he had not completely withdrawn from the digital spaces where he had once constructed his identity. Searches, activity, indicators that suggested he was still observing, still engaged in a way that did not align with someone attempting to disappear completely. This contradiction added another layer to the case, because it suggested that evasion was not the only objective. There was still a connection to visibility, to awareness of how the story was developing, how it was being perceived. It introduced the possibility that the same need for attention, the same desire to control narrative, had not been abandoned. It had simply taken a different form. For investigators, this presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge was clear. The suspect was mobile, adaptable, capable of shifting locations and identities. The opportunity lay in the fact that complete disappearance requires isolation, and isolation was not entirely consistent with the behavior being observed. If he continued to engage, even indirectly, there would be traces. And traces, no matter how small, can be followed. As the investigation continued, the focus narrowed, not because all questions had been answered, but because enough had been established to define a direction. The name was no longer tentative. It was central. The patterns were no longer fragmented. They were connected. The search was no longer about identifying a suspect. It was about finding him. And somewhere, beyond the reach of immediate detection but not beyond the reach of the evidence already gathered, he was still moving, carrying with him the assumption that distance could provide safety, that movement could delay consequence. But the distance was closing. Not suddenly, not in a way that would be immediately visible, but steadily, with each piece of information that aligned, with each connection that held, with each step that brought the investigation closer to its next turning point. The turning point did not arrive as a single revelation. It did not appear in one decisive piece of evidence that suddenly resolved every uncertainty. Instead, it emerged gradually from the convergence of details that had been building quietly beneath the surface of the investigation, each one carrying weight on its own, but together forming something that could no longer be ignored. By this stage, the name Luca Magnotta was no longer just a possibility. It had become the center of the case, the point around which every line of inquiry began to orbit. But knowing who was responsible and proving it are not the same thing. Between those 2 points lies a process that demands precision, patience, and evidence that can withstand scrutiny from every angle. What investigators needed was not just confirmation. They needed connection. They needed to take the fragments, the video, the apartment, the packages, the digital activity, and bind them together in a way that left no space for doubt, no gap where alternative explanations could take hold. That process required a level of detail that extended beyond the obvious, beyond what could be seen at first glance. It began with the video, not in terms of its content, which had already established the severity of the crime, but in its structure. The way it had been recorded, the elements within the frame, the objects that appeared briefly and then disappeared as the sequence progressed. Each of these details was examined, isolated, compared against known information. A piece of furniture, a section of wall, a fabric pattern. Individually, they meant very little. But when aligned with the physical space of the apartment, they began to match. Not perfectly at first, not in a way that immediately confirmed location, but closely enough to suggest that the two were connected. That what had been seen in the video had occurred within the same environment that had already been processed as a crime scene. This was the first layer of confirmation. From there, the focus shifted to digital traces. The file itself, the way it had been uploaded, the path it had taken through different platforms. These elements are often overlooked by those who view such material, but they contain information, timestamps, metadata, indicators of origin that can be extracted and analyzed. It is a process that requires both technical expertise and careful interpretation, because not every data point is reliable on its own. But patterns begin to emerge. An upload linked to a specific network. A network connected to a location. A location associated with a known identity. Each step does not stand alone. It builds on the previous one, reinforcing the connection, narrowing the range of possibilities. At the same time, the movement of the suspect was being reconstructed. Travel records, surveillance footage, witness accounts, each offering a glimpse into where he had been, when he had been there, and how he had moved between locations. These details do not always align perfectly at first. There are gaps, inconsistencies, moments where the trail seems to disappear. But those gaps can be bridged. A timestamp from one source aligns with a sighting from another. A transaction confirms presence in a place that had previously been uncertain. Slowly, the timeline becomes more complete, less fragmented, forming a sequence that can be followed from one point to the next. And within that sequence, a pattern becomes visible. Not random movement, not aimless travel, but a progression that reflects decision-making, adaptation, response to pressure. The suspect was not simply fleeing. He was navigating, adjusting his path based on what he believed the investigation would uncover next. But even the most calculated movement leaves traces. And those traces, once identified, begin to limit options. There are only so many directions one can take, only so many places one can go without leaving behind some form of record. The more those records are collected and aligned, the smaller the field becomes, the more defined the search area. At a certain point, the investigation reaches a threshold, a moment where the accumulation of evidence is no longer just suggestive, but conclusive, where the connections between the suspect and the crime are not based on probability, but on demonstrable links that can be presented, examined, and verified. This moment does not always feel dramatic. There is no sudden shift in atmosphere, no immediate sense of resolution. It is quieter than that, more precise. It is the point where uncertainty gives way to clarity, where the focus moves from identifying to locating, from building a case to closing in. For Luca Magnotta, that shift had already begun. The distance he had created, the movement that had once given him space, was no longer working in the same way. The same systems that had allowed him to move undetected were now being used to track him. The same digital environment that had provided a platform for visibility was now a source of evidence. What had once been an advantage was becoming a liability. And yet, there was no visible change in his behavior that suggested awareness of how close the investigation had come. If anything, the pattern remained consistent: movement, observation, a continued connection to the unfolding narrative of the case. This disconnect between the reality of the investigation and the perception of the suspect created a narrow window, a moment where action could be taken before that perception adjusted, before the pattern changed again. It is in these moments that cases turn, not because everything has been resolved, but because enough has been established to act with confidence, to move forward without hesitation. The groundwork has been laid, the connection secured, the uncertainties reduced to a level where they no longer prevent progress. And as that moment approached, the focus of the investigation shifted once more. From building to execution. From tracing the past to intercepting the present. The search was no longer open-ended. It was closing in. The courtroom does not carry the same kind of tension as a crime scene, but it holds something just as heavy. Not chaos, not confusion, but a controlled environment where every movement, every word, every pause is measured against a standard that allows no room for ambiguity. It is a place where narratives are not simply told. They are examined, challenged, broken apart, and reconstructed until only what can be supported remains. When Luca Magnotta was brought into that space, the contrast between the world he had constructed and the structure surrounding him became immediately apparent. There were no shifting identities here, no anonymous profiles, no carefully curated images designed to control perception. The environment did not respond to presentation. It responded to evidence. He sat within that framework, physically present but separated in a way that went beyond distance. The room was filled, legal professionals, observers, individuals connected to the case in ways that were both direct and indirect. Each of them carried a different perspective, a different reason for being there, but all were focused on the same process, the same unfolding examination of what had happened. Across from him, the prosecution began to build its case. Not with broad statements or emotional appeals, but with structure. A sequence of facts, each one supported by documentation, by testimony, by the material that had been gathered over the course of the investigation. The apartment, the video, the digital traces, the movement across borders. Each element introduced not as an isolated point, but as part of a larger system of connections. This is how cases are established. Not through a single decisive moment, but through accumulation. Detail layered upon detail until the overall picture becomes clear, until the narrative is not just plausible, but supported in a way that leaves little room for alternative interpretation. The video, when addressed, was not treated as spectacle. It was presented as evidence. Its structure analyzed, its elements connected to the physical space where the crime had occurred. The objects within it matched to items recovered. The environment within it aligned with the documented scene. The distance between digital representation and physical reality was reduced, step by step, until they could be understood as one and the same. Then came the digital trail. Records of activity, traces of presence that extended beyond a single location. The movement between countries, the use of networks, the attempts to remain both visible and hidden at the same time. Each of these details contributed to a pattern that was difficult to dismiss, one that suggested intention, awareness, and continuity. The defense did not remain silent. They introduced their own perspective, one that focused less on the sequence of events and more on the state of mind behind them. Questions were raised about psychological conditions, about the possibility that the actions being examined were not the result of full control, but of something more complex, something that could not be entirely reduced to deliberate choice. This introduced a different kind of tension into the room. Because while facts can be measured, supported, and verified, interpretation, especially when it involves the human mind, does not always follow the same clarity. It exists in a space where certainty is more difficult to establish, where conclusions depend on evaluation, on expertise, on the ability to connect behavior to underlying conditions. Experts were called. They spoke in careful terms, outlining possibilities, explaining frameworks that could be used to understand behavior that falls outside of what is considered typical. They did not speak in absolutes. They could not. Instead, they provided context, offering ways to interpret actions without reducing them to a single explanation. But even within that complexity, the core question remained. Not just what had happened, but whether the person responsible had understood those actions at the time they were committed. Whether there had been awareness, intention, the capacity to recognize consequence. The prosecution returned to the evidence. Not to dismiss the psychological dimension, but to place it alongside the actions themselves. The preparation, the execution, the steps taken afterward, the movement across borders, the continued engagement with the unfolding case. Each of these elements suggested a level of awareness, a pattern of behavior that aligned with decision-making rather than loss of control. The courtroom listened, not passively, but with attention that was both focused and critical. Every argument weighed, every piece of evidence considered within the framework of the law, within the standards that determine not just what is known, but what can be proven. Time moved differently here. Days structured by proceedings, by testimony, by the gradual progression from one phase to the next. There were no sudden shifts, no dramatic revelations that changed everything in an instant. Instead, there was a steady movement toward conclusion, built on the accumulation of everything that had been presented. And eventually, that conclusion had to be reached. The decision, when it came, did not carry spectacle. It was delivered within the same structure that had defined the entire process.
Clear. Direct.
Based on the evidence that had been examined from every angle, the charge, first-degree murder, was upheld. The arguments that had attempted to reframe the actions, to introduce doubt about intent, were considered but did not outweigh the consistency of the case that had been built. For Luca Magnotta, the outcome was definitive: life imprisonment. Not as a symbolic gesture, not as a response to public reaction, but as the application of law to a set of actions that had been established beyond reasonable doubt. A sentence that reflected both the severity of the crime and the structure within which it had been judged. In that moment, the legal process reached its end. Not the end of the story, not the end of its impact, but the point at which the system had fulfilled its role. The questions that could be answered within that framework had been addressed. The responsibility had been assigned. The consequences defined. The courtroom began to empty. People left carrying different things with them. Relief, reflection, perhaps a sense of closure, though not a complete one. Because closure in cases like this is not absolute. It does not erase what has happened, does not resolve every question, does not return what has been lost. But it marks a boundary. A point where one phase ends and another begins. Where the focus shifts away from determining what happened and toward understanding what remains. After the courtroom empties and the structure of the trial dissolves into memory, what remains is not the sound of verdicts or the weight of legal language, but something quieter, something that settles into the spaces where people return to their lives and attempt to understand what has just passed through them. Cases like this do not end when the sentence is delivered. They change form. They move from something immediate and procedural into something reflective, something that exists in the way people think, remember, and carry forward what they have witnessed. For those closest to June Lin, the shift is not defined by the conclusion of the trial. It is defined by absence. A space that does not fill itself, no matter how much time passes. The routines that once included him continue, but differently. Conversations that once might have happened no longer do. The small, ordinary moments that form the structure of daily life take on a different meaning when one presence is no longer there to share them. Grief does not follow a fixed pattern. It moves in cycles, sometimes quiet, sometimes overwhelming, often appearing without warning. It does not ask permission to return, and it does not resolve itself according to any timeline that can be measured from the outside. For a family separated by distance, by geography and language and the long stretch between one country and another, that grief carries an additional layer. It exists not only in memory, but in the spaces that cannot be revisited, in the distance that cannot be closed. And yet, within that grief, there is also remembrance. Not of the event that ended a life, but of the life itself. The moments that came before, the connections that were built, the quiet presence that shaped the people around him in ways that may not have been fully understood until it was gone. This is where the story resists reduction, where it refuses to be defined solely by what happened at the end. Because a life is not a single moment. It is a collection of them, layered over time, each one contributing to something that cannot be fully captured in any single narrative. To remember, that is to restore a sense of balance, to recognize that what was lost extends far beyond the details that drew public attention. At a broader level, the case leaves behind questions that do not settle easily. Not questions about evidence or procedure, those have been addressed, but questions about the environment in which all of this unfolded. The intersection between identity and visibility, between the desire to be seen and the consequences of how that visibility is pursued. The role of digital spaces in shaping behavior, in amplifying certain impulses, in creating feedback loops that can reinforce patterns in ways that are not always immediately visible. These are not questions with simple answers. They exist within a landscape that continues to evolve, where technology changes faster than the systems designed to understand it, where the boundaries between public and private, between performance and reality, are constantly shifting. What this case reveals is not a flaw in a single element, but a convergence of factors that, together, create conditions where something like this can take shape. It is important, though, not to draw conclusions that are too broad, too absolute. Not every use of technology leads to harm. Not every search for attention becomes destructive. But within the spectrum of human behavior, there are points where those elements intersect in ways that require awareness, that call for a deeper understanding of how they interact. The investigation itself demonstrated something else. That even in environments where anonymity seems possible, where identities can be fragmented and reconstructed, there are still ways to follow patterns, to connect actions to individuals, to establish accountability. The digital trail, once thought to provide distance, can also serve as a path back to the source. This duality, technology as both tool and evidence, is part of the legacy of the case. It changes how future investigations are approached, how digital behavior is interpreted, how connections are made between what happens online and what occurs in the physical world. It introduces a level of complexity that cannot be ignored, but also a set of capabilities that did not exist in the same way before. And still, beyond all of that, there is the human dimension. The recognition that behind every case, every investigation, every headline, there are individuals whose lives are directly affected in ways that extend far beyond the scope of public attention. People who must continue, who must find ways to move forward without the resolution that comes from understanding everything completely. Because some aspects of this story resist full explanation. Not in terms of what happened, but in terms of why it unfolded in exactly the way that it did. The motivations, the internal processes, the path from intention to action, these can be examined, analyzed, interpreted, but not entirely reduced to a single, definitive answer. And perhaps that is part of what lingers most. Not the facts themselves, but the space around them. The recognition that even in a world where so much can be documented, recorded, and analyzed, there are still elements of human behavior that remain difficult to fully grasp. That understanding has limits, and within those limits, there must be room for reflection rather than certainty. As time moves forward, the intensity of the case will fade. It will no longer occupy the same space in public attention, no longer be at the center of conversation. It will become one of many stories that have shaped the way people think about crime, about technology, about the intersections between them. But for those who carry it more closely, it will not disappear. It will remain, not as something that demands constant focus, but as something that exists in the background, influencing perspective in ways that are often quiet but enduring. And in that quiet persistence, there is a kind of continuation, not of the events themselves, but of the awareness they created. The understanding that actions have reach, that visibility has consequences, that the boundaries between different aspects of life are more connected than they might initially appear. The story does not end with a final statement. It settles into memory, into reflection, into the broader context of how people make sense of the world around them. And within that context, it remains, not as a closed chapter, but as something that continues to shape thought long after the details themselves have been absorbed into the past. Time has a way of smoothing the sharp edges of events, but it does not erase them. It softens the noise, quiets the headlines, allows daily life to reclaim its rhythm, yet beneath that surface, certain stories remain intact, unchanged in their core. This is one of them. Long after the investigation concluded, long after the courtroom emptied and the sentence was carried out, the case did not disappear. It transformed into something more subtle, more ingrained, woven into the collective awareness of a world that had watched it unfold. In the months that followed, the immediate shock gave way to something more reflective. People no longer spoke about the case with the same urgency, but they did not forget it either. It lingered in conversations about safety, about the internet, about the strange and often unsettling relationship between visibility and identity. It became a reference point, something invoked not always directly, but present in the background whenever similar patterns began to emerge elsewhere. For those who had followed the case closely, there was a gradual realization that what made it so disturbing was not only the crime itself, but the way it had been constructed. It was not hidden. It was not buried in secrecy. It had been placed in front of the world, deliberately, almost as if it were meant to be seen, to be consumed, to be reacted to. That element changed the nature of the crime, shifting it from something contained within a physical space to something that extended outward, reaching people who had no direct connection to it, yet felt its impact nonetheless. And that reach left a mark. It altered how people approached the digital world, even if only slightly. A moment of hesitation before clicking on a link. A second thought about the content that circulates so easily, so quickly, often without context or warning. It introduced a level of awareness that had not been as prominent before, a recognition that what exists online is not always separate from reality, that the boundary between the two is more permeable than it appears. At the same time, there was an effort, quiet, ongoing, to shift the focus back to where it belonged. Away from the perpetrator, away from the spectacle, and toward the life that had been lost. Because in the aftermath of cases like this, there is always a risk that the narrative becomes unbalanced, that the person responsible occupies more space in memory than the person who was taken. Correcting that imbalance does not happen automatically. It requires intention, a conscious decision to remember differently. And that remembrance takes many forms. It exists in the stories shared by those who knew him, in the details that do not appear in official reports, but define a person far more accurately than any summary ever could. It exists in the quiet acknowledgement of a life interrupted, in the understanding that behind every headline there is a reality that extends far beyond what is written. This is where the narrative finds its grounding again. Not in the act itself, not in the mechanics of the crime, but in the recognition of what was there before it happened. The ordinary moments, the plans that were never completed, the connections that continue to exist, even in absence. These are not details that demand attention in the same way as the crime, but they carry a different kind of weight. One that persists, one that shapes memory in a way that is less visible but more enduring. Beyond the personal, the case also left its imprint on systems. Law enforcement, legal frameworks, and digital platforms all found themselves confronted with questions that did not have immediate answers. How to respond to crimes that unfold simultaneously in physical and digital spaces. How to manage the spread of harmful content without infringing on the structures that allow information to move freely. How to recognize early warning signs when those signs are embedded within behavior that, on its own, might not trigger immediate concern. These questions did not resolve themselves with the conclusion of the case. They continued, evolving alongside the very systems they were meant to address. Policies were discussed, adjusted, reconsidered. Approaches to digital evidence became more refined, more integrated into investigative processes. There was no single change that could be pointed to as the outcome, but rather a series of shifts, each one contributing to a broader adaptation. And yet, even with those changes, there remains a fundamental truth that cannot be fully addressed by systems alone. Human behavior does not always follow predictable patterns. It does not always present clear signals before crossing into something harmful. There are moments where intention develops quietly, where the outward appearance of normalcy masks something more complex beneath. Recognizing those moments requires more than procedure. It requires awareness, attention, a willingness to look beyond what is immediately visible. This is not a solution. It is an acknowledgement of complexity. As time continues to move forward, the case becomes part of a larger history, one that includes many other stories, each with its own context, its own impact. It is no longer isolated, no longer at the center of attention, but it has not lost its relevance. It remains as an example, as a reminder, as something that can be revisited when trying to understand how certain patterns develop and what they can lead to. For some, it will always be personal. For others, it will remain something observed from a distance, a story encountered once and then carried forward in fragments. But regardless of how it is remembered, it does not disappear entirely. It becomes part of the way people interpret similar events, part of the framework through which new information is processed. And in that sense, it continues. Not in the form of repetition, not as something that defines the present, but as something that informs it. A quiet presence, shaping perspective in ways that are not always immediately apparent, but are there nonetheless. There is no clean ending to a story like this. No point where everything is resolved and placed neatly in the past. Instead, there is a gradual transition, a movement away from the intensity of the moment into something more reflective, more subdued. The details remain, but their impact changes, becoming less immediate, more integrated into a broader understanding of the world. And perhaps that is where it ultimately settles. Not as a single event, but as part of a larger conversation about responsibility, about awareness, about the ways in which actions extend beyond their origin and into the lives of others. A conversation that does not end, but continues quietly, carried forward by those who remember, those who reflect, and those who seek to understand not just what happened, but what it means. There is a moment, long after everything has been said and documented, when a case stops feeling like an event and begins to feel like a presence. Not something loud or immediate, but something that exists quietly in the background, influencing how people interpret the world around them without always realizing it. It does not demand attention the way it once did, but it does not disappear either. It lingers in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses before decisions, in the subtle shifts of perception that follow exposure to something that cannot be fully undone. For those who study cases like this, who return to them not out of curiosity but out of a need to understand, there is always a point where the details stop being new and start becoming patterns. The individual elements, the apartment, the video, the movement across borders, the trial, settle into a framework that can be compared, contrasted, analyzed alongside others. And in that comparison, something becomes clearer. This was not an isolated anomaly. It was an extreme expression of tendencies that, in smaller forms, exist elsewhere. The desire to be seen, the need to control how one is perceived, the gradual merging of identity with performance until the boundary between the two becomes difficult to distinguish. These elements are not, on their own, inherently dangerous. They are part of human behavior, amplified in a world where visibility is more accessible than ever before. But when they intersect with other factors, detachment, obsession, the erosion of empathy, they can evolve into something else entirely. That evolution is rarely sudden. It does not begin with an act that draws attention. It begins in smaller ways, in patterns that might seem insignificant at first, in behaviors that do not immediately signal the direction they are heading. This is part of what makes them difficult to identify, difficult to address before they escalate beyond control. Looking back at the trajectory of Luca Magnotta, there is a progression that becomes visible only in hindsight. The construction of identity through curated images. The creation of narratives that place the self at the center of attention. The gradual introduction of more extreme content, designed not just to be seen, but to provoke reaction. Each step builds on the previous one, reinforcing the behavior, pushing it further. At no single point does it necessarily appear as a clear warning, but taken together, the pattern is unmistakable. This is one of the challenges that emerges from cases like this, the difficulty of recognizing a trajectory while it is still unfolding. Because in real time, the information is incomplete. The context is missing. The connections that later seem obvious have not yet been established. And yet, there were people who noticed. Individuals who encountered the earlier signs, who felt that something was not right, who attempted to piece together what they were seeing. Their efforts did not immediately lead to intervention, did not stop what would eventually happen, but they represent an important aspect of the broader picture. The presence of awareness, even if it is not always sufficient to change the outcome. This introduces a question that extends beyond the specifics of the case. What does it mean to recognize something as potentially harmful before it becomes undeniably so? And what can be done with that recognition when the boundaries between concern and certainty are not clearly defined? There are no easy answers. Intervening too early, without clear evidence, carries its own risks. Waiting for certainty can mean waiting too long. The balance between these 2 points is difficult to maintain, especially in environments where behavior can be both visible and obscured at the same time. The digital landscape complicates this further. It allows for the projection of identity without the constraints that exist in physical interaction. It enables the amplification of certain traits, the suppression of others, the creation of personas that may or may not align with reality. This flexibility can be used in constructive ways, but it can also facilitate patterns that, in different circumstances, might be more easily recognized. In this case, The online and offline worlds did not exist separately. They reinforced each other. The actions taken in one space influenced the behavior in the other, creating a loop that intensified over time. Visibility led to reaction. Reaction reinforced behavior. Behavior escalated, seeking greater impact, greater recognition, until it crossed a threshold. And once that threshold was crossed, the consequences extended far beyond the individual who initiated them. This is where the focus must shift again. Away from analysis of the perpetrator, away from the mechanisms that allowed the behavior to develop, and back toward the impact. Because understanding the how and the why is important, but it does not exist in isolation from the effects those actions have on others. For Junlin, the story is not about patterns or trajectories. It is about a life that intersected with another in a moment that should never have occurred. A moment that was not predictable from his perspective, not something that could have been anticipated or avoided based on the information available to him. This randomness, the absence of a clear connection between victim and perpetrator, is part of what makes the case so unsettling. It challenges the assumption that risk can always be identified, that danger follows recognizable paths. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it emerges from directions that cannot be fully accounted for, from individuals whose internal processes are not visible to those around them. This does not mean that awareness is meaningless or that precaution has no value, but it does highlight the limits of what can be controlled. And within those limits, there is a need for something else. Not just vigilance, but empathy. An understanding that behind every case, beyond every analysis, there are people whose experiences cannot be reduced to data points or behavioral patterns. Their lives, their relationships, their losses, these are the elements that give weight to the story, that remind us why it matters. As the case continues to recede into the past, its presence changes. It becomes less about the specifics and more about the impressions it leaves behind, the questions it raises, the awareness it creates, the subtle shifts in how people perceive the world around them, even if they cannot always trace those shifts back to a single source. And in that transformation, it takes on a different kind of permanence. Not as an event that demands constant attention, but as something that has been integrated into a broader understanding of human behavior, of risk, of the complex interplay between visibility and action. It remains, quietly, persistently, shaping thought in ways that are not always visible, but are there nonetheless. In the years that followed, the case did not simply fade into the background as another closed file in the archives of criminal history. Instead, it settled into a different kind of existence, one that resurfaced in discussions, in academic analysis, in quiet moments when people reconsidered the relationship between what is seen and what is real. It became less about the sequence of events and more about the underlying currents that had carried those events into motion. There's a tendency, when looking back, to search for a single point where everything could have been different, a moment where intervention might have altered the outcome, where a decision might have redirected the path. But cases like this resist that kind of simplification. They are not built on a single turning point. They are constructed over time, through layers of behavior, perception, and response that gradually align in a way that is only fully visible in retrospect. For Luca Magnotta, the construction of identity was not an incidental detail. It was central, the effort to shape how others perceived him, to control the narrative that surrounded him, to exist not just as a person but as an image. These were not secondary traits. They were foundational. And when that foundation began to intersect with darker impulses, the result was not hidden away. It was displayed. This is where the case diverges from many others. It was not an act committed in secrecy and then concealed. It was an act that was presented, framed, distributed. The distinction matters because it changes the role of the audience. It introduces a dynamic where observation becomes part of the event, where reaction becomes a form of participation, even if unintended. This dynamic raises questions that extend beyond the individual. What responsibility exists in the act of viewing? What happens when harmful content is amplified, not out of support, but out of shock, curiosity, or outrage? At what point does attention, regardless of intent, contribute to the very visibility that the act was designed to achieve? These are uncomfortable questions. They do not assign blame to those who encounter such material, but they do highlight the complexity of interaction in a connected world. The line between witness and participant is not always clearly defined, especially when information moves as quickly and as widely as it does now. At the same time, the systems that govern that movement continue to evolve. Platforms adjust their policies. Mechanisms for reporting and removing harmful content become more refined. There is an ongoing effort to respond, to adapt, to prevent similar situations from unfolding in the same way. But these responses are always, to some extent, reactive. They follow events rather than precede them, shaped by what has already occurred. This creates a continuous cycle. An action leads to a response. The response alters the environment. The altered environment changes how future actions might unfold. It is a process without a fixed endpoint, one that reflects the constant interaction between human behavior and the systems that attempt to manage it. Within this cycle, the case remains a reference point. Not because it defines everything that follows, but because it represents a moment where multiple elements converged in a way that exposed the limitations of existing frameworks. It showed how quickly boundaries can be crossed, how difficult it can be to respond in real time, how complex the intersection between digital and physical realities has become. And yet, beyond all of this structural analysis, there is still the human element that resists abstraction. For June Lin, the narrative is not about systems or patterns. It is about a life that extended far beyond the moment that brought it into public awareness. A life that included aspirations, relationships, experiences that cannot be fully reconstructed from the outside, but are nonetheless real in the impact they had on those who knew him. This is where reflection must return, again and again. Not to the spectacle, not to the mechanics of the crime, but to the recognition of what was lost. To the understanding that behind every analysis, every discussion, there is a reality that cannot be reduced to theory. This is what grounds the story, what prevents it from becoming something distant, something detached from the human experience. As time continues to move forward, the intensity of the case diminishes, but its influence does not disappear. It becomes part of a broader awareness, something that informs how people approach similar situations, how they interpret certain behaviors, how they understand the potential consequences of actions that might otherwise seem disconnected. It is not always at the forefront of thought, but it is present, integrated into the way people process information. There is also a quieter shift that takes place. A recognition that not all stories have clear resolutions, that understanding does not always lead to closure. The legal process may conclude, the facts may be established, but the deeper questions about motivation, about the pathways that lead to such actions, remain open to interpretation. This is not a failure of the process. It is a reflection of the complexity of human behavior. There are aspects of it that can be studied, categorized, explained within certain frameworks. And there are aspects that remain elusive, that resist complete understanding. Accepting that limitation is part of engaging with cases like this in a meaningful way. It allows for reflection without the need for definitive answers. It creates space for awareness, for consideration, for the kind of understanding that does not rely on certainty, but on the acknowledgement of complexity. And within that space, the story continues, not as an active event, but as a point of reference, a reminder of what can occur when certain elements align. It remains in the background, shaping thought in subtle ways, influencing how future situations are perceived and interpreted. And perhaps that is where its lasting impact lies. Not in the details that were once so immediate and overwhelming, but in the quieter, more enduring shifts in perspective that follow. There comes a stage in every story like this when repetition gives way to residue, when the facts have been revisited so many times that what remains is not the sequence itself, but the imprint it leaves behind on those who continue to think about it. The case is no longer unfolding, no longer being actively built or argued, yet it continues to exist in a quieter form, embedded in the way people interpret patterns, in the way certain details trigger recognition long after the original context is faded. It is in this stage that the distance between observer and subject becomes more apparent. Because the further one moves from the immediacy of the events, the clearer it becomes that what was witnessed was not just a crime, but a convergence of elements that, under different circumstances, might have remained separate. The digital persona, the private individual, the act itself, the audience. Each of these could exist independently, but in this case, they did not. They overlapped, reinforced each other, created a structure that extended beyond a single moment. Looking back at Luca Magnotta, what stands out is not only the actions, but the continuity of intention that runs through them. The careful construction of identity, the persistence in maintaining visibility, the refusal to disappear even when disappearance might have offered a form of protection. This continuity suggests something more than impulse. It suggests a framework, a way of operating that remained consistent even as the circumstances changed. And within that framework, there is a question that continues to surface. What does it mean to be seen? Not in the simple sense of being noticed, but in the deeper sense of having one's existence acknowledged, recognized, validated by others. For most people, this need is balanced by other considerations: empathy, consequence, connection. But when that balance shifts, when the need for visibility begins to override those other elements, the result can take forms that are difficult to predict. This is not unique to one individual. It is a spectrum, one that exists in varying degrees across different contexts. What makes this case distinct is not the presence of that need, but the way it was pursued, the extent to which it was allowed to shape behavior without restraint. And yet, even within that analysis, there is a limit to how much can be understood from the outside. Motivation can be examined, patterns can be identified, but there remains a gap between observation and experience, between what can be described and what was actually felt in the moments that led to each decision. This gap is not a failure of analysis, it is an inherent part of it. It reminds us that understanding is always partial, always shaped by the perspective from which it is approached. For Jun Lin, the story exists on an entirely different plane. It is not about patterns or frameworks or the evolution of behavior. It is about presence and absence, about the sudden interruption of a life that was moving forward in its own direction, independent of the forces that would eventually intersect with it. That intersection was not chosen, not anticipated, not something that could have been avoided through awareness alone. This randomness is difficult to reconcile. It challenges the instinct to look for explanations that provide a sense of control, that suggest outcomes can be predicted or prevented with enough information. While there are always lessons to be drawn, always patterns to be recognized, there are also moments where those patterns do not provide the clarity we seek. And in those moments, what remains is not explanation, but recognition. Recognition of loss. Recognition of impact. Recognition that behind every case, no matter how complex or widely discussed, there are individuals whose experiences cannot be fully translated into narrative form. As the case continues to move further into the past, its presence changes again. It becomes less about analysis and more about integration. The details that once required active recall begin to settle into a more passive awareness, something that informs perception without requiring constant attention. It is not forgotten, but it is no longer at the forefront of thought.
This is how memory evolves.
It does not remain fixed. It shifts, adapts, repositions itself within a broader context. What was once immediate becomes reflective. What was once overwhelming becomes something that can be approached with a different kind of understanding. And within that shift, there is space for a different kind of reflection. One that is not focused solely on what happened, but on how it is remembered, how it is carried forward, how it influences the way similar situations are perceived in the future. This reflection is quieter, less driven by urgency, but no less significant. Because it is in this stage that the lasting impact of the case becomes most apparent. Not in the details that were once so prominent, but in the subtle changes in awareness, in the way certain behaviors are interpreted, in the recognition of patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. It does not prevent everything. It does not provide complete protection. But it alters perception, and in doing so, it changes how people respond. There is no definitive conclusion to be drawn from this. No single lesson that can be applied universally. Instead, there is a collection of insights, each one shaped by perspective, by experience, by the way the story has been processed over time. These insights do not form a closed system. They remain open, adaptable, subject to change as new information, new contexts, new cases emerge. And perhaps that openness is what allows the story to remain relevant. Not as something fixed, but as something that continues to interact with the present, to influence thought in ways that are not always visible, but are nonetheless real. It does not demand attention, but it remains available to it, ready to be revisited, reconsidered, reinterpreted. In that sense, it never fully ends. It transitions. From event to memory, from memory to perspective, from perspective to something that quietly shapes the way the world is understood.